Hello, this is Jerry from Paly Python, and today we'll be looking at how to use loops in Python. Now let's say you wanted to make a program to print hi 5 times. Something you might think of doing is this, just writing print hi 5 times on 5 different lines. And sure, this program does work, but it is a bit messy and it takes up 5 lines just to print something 5 times. To make this more efficient, we have a structure in programming called a loop, which lets us repeat certain portions of code multiple times if we want. And so there are two types of loops, the for loop and the while loop. First, we'll be taking a look at the for loop. So how we use a for loop is first we have the keyword for, then a space, and then we'll put our iterator variable. So it's usually called I. What an iterator variable is, it's a temporary variable that only exists in the loop. They'll be doing the incrementing, that is, the repeating of the loop a certain amount of times. So we have our iterator variable I, and then we have this operator that Python lets us use, which is in. Might have already seen it before. It lets us check if something is in another structure. In this case, it lets us say that I will be in a certain range. And then we have a range object that we generate using the range function. And then the range function takes 3 arguments, the start, stop, and the step. Now we'll be going over the step later, but first, for now, all you need to know is the start and the stop. So this is where the range will start and stop at. So we'll be creating a range from 1 to 5, and then our colon to define a new block. And then we'll print hi. Now, as you could see, this code did repeat the statement, but it only printed hi 4 times. This is a small quirk of Python and also most other programming languages. Whenever using for loops or other iteration, the I variable will only increment from 1 to 1 less than the largest number you specified. So to fix this problem, we could just simply put 6 here instead of 5. And now our program works. It prints hi 5 times. So this is just a simple example of how you could use for loops. So let's take another example. What if we wanted to print all of the elements in a list? Before, you just might have printed the entire list, but we could actually use a for loop to go through the elements one by one and even change them if we want. So let's have a list. My list equals 1, 3, 6, 2, 7, 4. And then we can use the same for loop syntax. So for our variable, let's call it num. You could just call this variable anything you want. It doesn't necessarily have to be I. So for num, and then our in operator again, so in, and we'll say for num in my list. What this will do is it'll replace num with all of these numbers in my list for every single execution of this. This will become more clear once we run the example. We'll just simply print out the number. And as you can see, it printed 1, 3, 6, 2, 7, 4, all of the numbers in my list. This just sets the value of num equal to the first one, executes the statement, then equal to the second one, executes the statement, and so on until all of the elements in my list have been iterated through. Now, what if we wanted to change the value of an element in the list in the loop? We can't set num equal to some value in this because num is only a reference to the integer value, not the value itself. So what we can do is instead of looping directly through the list, we could use the range object again to loop through the indexes in the list. So we could create a new range, and then we'll start at 0, but you don't necessarily have to put this. So a shorthand you could do is if your range starts at 0, you don't necessarily have to put it. So let's just put it anyway. So we'll start at 0, and then our stop will be the length of my list. So we could use the len function to get the length of the list. And remember how for loop stopped at 1 before the largest index. Now the length of my list is 6 elements, and since array started at 0, the largest index will be 5, which means this works out pretty well for us. So we'll print the number, which is the index, and then we'll print the value at the index. So my list num. And as you can see, this will print out all of the indexes and all of the corresponding values of the list. Now another thing we could do is edit the values of the list in this for loop directly. We couldn't do that in the old loop because it was only a reference to the value, but now we have the index, we could edit the list itself. So we could just set my list num equal to 3 if we want to set every single value in the list to 3. And at the end, we'll just print out the entire list. So as you can see, this will print out all of the indexes and their corresponding values. Then it'll set them all to 3, and then it'll print out the list at the very end. What if we wanted to iterate through every second element of the array instead of every single element? So now this is where the step part of the range function comes in. So you might have noticed earlier that we can actually pass a third argument into range, which is what increment it'll go up by. This doesn't necessarily have to be 1, although it is 1 by default. So if we put a step of 2 here, then this means our loop, our num, will increase by 2 every time until it reaches the limit. So now what this will do is it'll set every second element of the array to 3. And as you can see, it printed out 0, 2, and 4, and it set these all to 3 in the list. One thing to be careful of when using for loops and lists is to make sure that you don't go over the last index of the list. So let's say we just did something weird here. We just put 10 for num in range 0 to 10. Now since the element at 10 or anything higher than 5 doesn't exist in the list, we'll get an error. So this is just one thing to be careful of. So that's basically how you use a for loop. Now let's get into while loops, which, as the name suggests, lets you execute a series of statements while a condition remains true. And so for while, we don't have an iterator variable sense. It is only just while and then our condition. So this is just the same condition you might see in an if statement, just a Boolean condition that either evaluates true or false. So let's set up the sense. Because of this, while loops are a bit harder to use and require some setup. So let's set this up with a variable. Let's say condition, or let's say like found equals false. If we want to iterate through list until we found a certain value, we could use a while loop for this. So let's set up another list. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so we have our Boolean variable here, found equals false. So we could do this. So while not found. So this will execute the statement in this block while found remains false. And we'll have another index variable here. So let's say index equals 0. And then in this block, let's put if my list index equals, let's say we want to find 4, then we'll say print 4 is found at index, and then our index. And then this is the crucial part, we'll set found to true, which means that this statement not found will be valued to false and our loop will exit. So else, if we didn't find it, just print looped over value at index next. And so what this code will do is it'll loop through the list until we found 4. Once we found it, we'll print it out, set found to true, which means we'll exit the while loop. Else, we'll just have looped over the value at the index and we'll print that out. And actually, at the end here, we'll just print exit statement. And we'll see why this is important later. And, oh, I forgot to increment the variable. Okay, so we'll do index plus equals 1. What this does is just increases by 1 every time the loop executes. So what this will do is looped over value at index 0, we didn't find it, index 1 didn't find it, index 2 didn't find it, and we found 4 at index 3, and so we've exited the loop. And so this statement is actually very crucial in while loops, otherwise the loop will run forever. As we saw before, if we didn't have this statement, then the index would always remain 0 since it's not automatically incremented in the while loop. And then our program will just run forever and ever with index stuck at 0 and we'll be stuck checking at index 0 of the list. This is another thing to be careful of when using while loops, to make sure that your loop doesn't run infinitely ever. These are the basics of how to use loops in Python, and I hope you learned something.